Chicago, early spring, gray sky pressing low like the city itself was grieving. My father's funeral was supposed to be about final goodbyes, about shaking hands with neighbors who hadn't spoken to him since Clinton was in office, about pretending we were a family when we hadn't been one for decades. Instead, 3 sentences into the lawyer's speech at the reception, my stomach dropped. He cleared his throat, shuffled the papers, and announced that in my father's will, my name wasn't there. Not once. Not even a scrap of acknowledgement. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the sound of my brother David's smirk. Yes, you can hear a smirk when it belongs to an older brother who always believed the world should orbit around him. My sister Linda leaned in close to him, whispering something behind her manicured nails. They didn't bother hiding their delight. Our mother sat stiff as a church pew, hands clasped, eyes down. Not a word of defense, not even a glance in my direction. Betrayal wears many faces, but sometimes it looks exactly like family in their Sunday best, quietly celebrating that you've been erased. I wanted to laugh, the kind of laugh that comes from the gut when life confirms your darkest suspicions. My father had been a man of rules and punishment. He believed in hard work, discipline, and the kind of silence that made children sit up straighter at the dinner table. He was respected in our Chicago neighborhood, the kind of man people nodded to on the street and spoke about in half whispers. He worked his way up from nothing, built a business, and made sure everyone knew he hadn't been handed a damn thing. But respect has a shadow, and in our house that shadow was fear. He had a mean streak that cut sharper than a belt. Words weren't weapons in his hands, they were verdicts, final and brutal. And yet, despite all of that, I stayed. I was the one who didn't leave when college offered a ticket out. I was the one who ran errands, handled bills when he grew older, and endured his criticism long after David had built his suburban empire and Linda was sipping cocktails on the coast. And now, according to the legal gospel being read in front of the crowd, I was the invisible child. David chuckled under his breath as the lawyer continued, and I swear it was louder than the minister's prayer earlier that morning. Linda's eyes glittered like she had won a prize. My mother pressed her lips tight, and I caught her hand trembling slightly against her lap. She could have said something, anything, but she didn't. Maybe she was too shocked, maybe she was complicit. Either way, I was alone in that room full of people who claimed to share my blood. As the lawyer droned on about property in Michigan and accounts that would now belong to David and Linda, my mind spun backward. Memories surfaced uninvited. My father barking orders while I carried heavy boxes in the freezing garage, his gruff approval when I fixed his broken fence without asking, his quiet dependence on me when he got sick and I was the one who drove him to the hospital. There had been moments, tiny ones, when I thought he saw me not just as the leftover child but as the one who stayed. Surely those counted for something. But if they did, they didn't make it onto that will. The guests murmured, shifting uncomfortably, as though they'd stumbled into a scene too personal for outsiders. I stood still, my jaw tight, while David leaned back in his chair like a king admiring his new throne. Linda crossed her legs slowly, savoring the moment. I could almost hear her rehearsing the story she would tell her friends later, how the black sheep brother was finally cut loose. My mother rose to leave, but she didn't meet my eyes. She never did when things got ugly. That night, long after the crowd had gone home and the house smelled like lilies and stale coffee, I sat in the dark with a glass of whiskey and the will replaying in my head. Why me? Why the one who sacrificed the most, who gave up years, who took the blows and stayed standing? My father always said a man's word was his bond. But I couldn't shake the suspicion that the words read by the lawyer weren't his. They felt twisted, manipulated, like someone else's fingerprints were all over them. I didn't announce it out loud, what would be the point? But in that silence, with the city lights flickering against the window, I made a vow. If my father thought death was the end of our unfinished business, he was wrong. I was going to find out what really happened. And when I did, I wouldn't just hold the truth. I'd hold the pen. The morning after the funeral, I woke up with the kind of hangover that wasn't just about whiskey but about anger fermenting in the bloodstream. My apartment still smelled like lilies because someone had left funeral flowers in my car, and I had dumped them in the corner like a crime scene reminder. I poured black coffee into a chipped mug and decided that if my father had cut me out, I was damn well going to understand why. The old man had kept boxes of paperwork stacked in the garage, meticulously labeled in his military-style handwriting. The first step was obvious: dig through the past he left behind. I drove to the house, let myself in with the key he never asked me to return, and found the boxes exactly where I remembered, lined up like soldiers against the wall. Sorting through them was like flipping through a stranger's diary written in tax returns and business receipts. Faded invoices, real estate deeds, scribbled notes with numbers that didn't quite add up. My father had been strict about many things, but clean paperwork wasn't one of them. Somewhere between the receipts for lumber and a stack of outdated insurance policies, I found correspondence with his business partner, an old guy named Frank who had vanished from our lives years ago. I dialed the number on one of the letters, half expecting a disconnected signal, but Frank answered with a gravelly voice that carried decades of cigarettes. When I mentioned my father's name, there was a pause long enough to make me think I'd been hung up on. Then he said, "If you're calling about the will, don't." Things weren't what they seemed at the end. Those words stuck like burrs. I pushed for more, but Frank clammed up, muttering something about promises and graves, and hung up. It wasn't much, but it was enough to smell smoke. And where there's smoke, there's usually some bastard playing with matches. Meanwhile, my siblings made sure to remind me I was an outsider now. David posted a photo on social media of him standing in front of my father's prized Cadillac, grinning like a lottery winner. Linda sent me a text with a screenshot of the lawyer's paperwork, just in case I had missed the fine print. "It's official," she wrote, "you're free from responsibility." She added a winking emoji for good measure, the digital equivalent of spitting in my face. I couldn't help but laugh. If they thought flaunting their victory was going to break me, they clearly hadn't paid attention to the last 40 years. I'd been broken before, taped myself back together, and walked into work the next day. Sarcasm and survival were the only tools I'd inherited, and I was about to sharpen them. Late that night, fueled by caffeine and spite, I kept digging through my father's documents. That's when I found it, an envelope shoved behind a drawer in his desk as though it had been hidden on purpose. The paper inside was brittle, yellowed at the edges, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was a draft of a will, dated only a few months before his death. And in that draft my name was there. Clear as daylight. He had listed me not as an afterthought but as the executor, the one meant to oversee everything. The language wasn't polished, but the intention was solid. I was supposed to be holding the reins. The blood drained from my face as I compared it to the official document the lawyer had read. Entire sentences had been swapped out. Names rearranged. My role erased like I'd never existed. The signatures didn't even match perfectly. The draft had his heavy, deliberate scrawl, the kind that carved into paper, while the final version looked shaky, thin, almost hesitant. I sat back in the creaking chair, heart pounding. Humor was my shield, but this wasn't funny anymore. Someone had messed with my father's last words, and it didn't take a detective to figure out who stood to gain. David and Linda were already bathing in their spoils, and my mother had gone mute. But forgery? Manipulation of a dying man? That was a whole different game. I tucked the draft back into the envelope and stared at the pen resting on the desk. A simple ballpoint, cheap like the kind you steal from a bank. The same kind my father used to sign checks, to scrawl reminders on post-it notes, to write the list that kept his world in order. The question gnawed at me, colder than the Chicago wind sneaking through the cracked window. When that final will was signed, was it really his hand on the pen? Or was someone else guiding it, pressing it down, rewriting not just his words but my entire life? I didn't wait long before taking the draft will straight to my brother's house. David lived in one of those sterile suburban palaces outside Chicago, the kind with granite countertops no one cooks on and a perfectly trimmed lawn that probably had more chemicals than a pharmacy. He opened the door in a polo shirt, beer in hand, already smiling like he'd been expecting me. I held up the envelope without a word. His smirk faltered for half a second before returning, tighter, meaner. "Old papers," he said, waving it off, but his eyes lingered on it like a hungry dog staring at a steak. Linda joined us a few minutes later, floating down the staircase in silk pajamas, coffee cup in hand as if she was auditioning for a reality show. I put the draft on the table between us. "Explain this," I said. The sparks came fast. David accused me of desperation, of inventing ghosts because I couldn't handle being left out. Linda laughed, the kind of laugh that's half dagger, half perfume. "You always thought you were the favorite," she sneered. "Guess Dad set the record straight." My blood boiled, but I kept my voice calm, almost mocking. "Funny thing though, the signature here doesn't match the one on the final will. You both sure Dad was the one holding the pen?" That landed like a grenade. David's jaw clenched. Linda's cup shook slightly before she set it down. They didn't deny it outright, but they didn't confirm anything either. Instead, they doubled down on arrogance, calling me bitter, ungrateful, pathetic. I left before my fists decided to make a point for me. The next day I walked into the lawyer's office downtown, the same office where he had read the will with his somber, rehearsed tone. His name was Charles, and he had the kind of face that looked permanently uncomfortable, like a man who had eaten too many lies for breakfast. I slid the draft across his polished desk. He didn't touch it immediately. His fingers twitched, his eyes darted to the bookshelf, then back to me. "Where did you find this?" he asked, voice low. I didn't answer. I just watched him sweat. He skimmed the paper and sighed. "Your father changed his mind in the end," he said, rehearsed again but weaker this time. I leaned forward. "Did he change his mind, Charles, or did someone help him change his handwriting too?" He bristled, muttered something about confidentiality, and tried to steer the conversation back to legal procedure. But I had already seen it. The nervous glance, the tightening of his jaw, the way his hand hovered over the pen on his desk as if it were evidence itself. He knew more than he was willing to say. Walking out, I couldn't shake the timeline. The draft was dated months before his death, clear, strong handwriting. The final version appeared just days before he passed, shaky, uneven. My father's hand had always been heavy, steady, even when he was sick. The pen in the draft had carved grooves deep into the paper. The final version looked like it had been guided, hesitant, almost forced. Someone had been there in that hospital room, pushing ink across paper in his name. The memory of those last days clawed back. I remembered sitting by his bed, the smell of disinfectant and overcooked hospital food filling the air. His voice was gravel but still sharp. He tried to tell me something one evening, his lips forming words, his hand twitching like he wanted to grab mine. But Linda had breezed in with her perfume cloud and false cheer, cutting him off, telling him to rest. David stood by the window, arms crossed, watching everything like a guard. I never heard what my father tried to say. At the time I thought it was nothing, a fragment lost in the noise of machines. Now I wasn't so sure. Maybe that was the moment the pen moved without him. Back at home, I stared at the draft again, running my thumb over the thick lines of his handwriting. That pen had been his weapon and his shield, his way of controlling everything, right down to our futures. But if someone else had been the one pressing it to paper at the end, then the will wasn't his last word at all. It was theirs. And I wasn't about to let their version of the story become law. I poured myself another drink, the bitterness burning all the way down. For once, my sarcasm didn't lighten the weight in my chest. My father had raised me to believe a man's word mattered, that contracts were sacred, that signatures were ironclad. If his last word had been stolen, then it was on me to take it back. I folded the draft carefully, slipped it into a folder, and looked out the window at the city lights. The fight wasn't going to be clean, and it sure as hell wasn't going to be polite. But it was going to happen. Next stop, court. The courthouse in New York smelled like polished wood, stale coffee, and desperation. Families have a way of turning legal proceedings into blood sport, and mine was no exception. I sat at the plaintiff's table with my lawyer, a sharp woman named Karen who thrived on cross-examinations the way sharks thrive on blood in the water. Across the aisle, David looked smug in his tailored suit, while Linda had the nerve to wear pearls, as if she were auditioning for a role as grieving daughter of the year. Their lawyer droned through opening remarks about final wishes and honoring the deceased, while my stomach churned. This wasn't about honoring anyone, it was about gutting a man's last words and stuffing them with greed. The first round of arguments went about as expected. Their attorney painted me as the bitter son, desperate for money, clinging to old scraps of paper like a drowning man clutching driftwood. He gestured dramatically at the official will, sealed and notarized as though the signature alone was holy scripture. Karen stood up next, cool as ice, and dropped the first bomb. A certified handwriting analysis showing that the signature on the final will didn't match my father's long-established style. The grooves were shallow, inconsistent, and lacked the pressure of a man who had always written like he was carving stone tablets. The courtroom murmured, the judge frowned, and David shifted in his chair for the first time. Then came the nurse. She was small, quiet, her voice steady in a way that only truth can make it. She testified that in my father's last days, he was weak but lucid, and more than once she had seen Linda hovering over him with papers while David whispered in the corner. My sibling's lawyer objected, tried to discredit her, but the seed was planted. The jury of strangers could imagine it too well. A dying man, a pen placed in his trembling hand, his words hijacked in those final hours. But the real twist came when the court called an unexpected witness. Frank, my father's old business partner. The man had aged like whiskey left too long in a barrel, rough and sharp, but his voice carried weight. He leaned on the stand and spoke about visiting my father in the hospital. He had seen David and Linda pressuring him, pushing papers in front of him, speaking over his attempts to talk. He tried to wave them off, Frank said, but they wouldn't let up. He wanted to tell me something, but Linda told me it wasn't a good time. His testimony hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. The heat rose fast. Linda's polished mask cracked and she snapped at the nurse, accusing her of lying for attention. David slammed his fist on the table, muttering that I had orchestrated this circus. Their arrogance boiled over into naked greed when Linda shouted, "We deserved it more than him. Dad owed us." The room went silent. Even their lawyer looked like he wanted to crawl under the desk. The judge banged the gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. Their greed wasn't a suspicion anymore, it was a confession. The judge sat back, fingers steepled, eyes darting between the draft will, the testimony, and the official document. His hesitation was thick enough to taste. Then, just when the room seemed to be teetering toward chaos, Charles, the family lawyer who had squirmed under my stare weeks before, asked permission to approach. He carried a small envelope, yellowed with age, sealed in wax. He explained, voice trembling, that my father had left behind a final personal note, placed in his office safe with instructions to reveal it only if the will was ever contested. Gasps filled the courtroom as the judge slit the seal open and unfolded the paper. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. The note was written in my father's strong hand, the kind that dug into paper like stone carving. His words were short, almost painfully so. "If they fight, it means they never learned what mattered. The one who stayed will know what to do." The judge read it aloud and the room erupted. My siblings looked pale, their mouths opening and closing without sound. Frank lowered his head like he'd known all along. "Me?" I sat still, pulse hammering, because in that moment I realized the truth. This wasn't about money, not about cars, not about property lines on some deed. It was about who held the pen when the story ended. And my father had just handed it to me. The courtroom had gone dead silent after the judge read the letter aloud. My father's handwriting was unmistakable, thick, forceful strokes that dug into the paper, each word as deliberate as a hammer strike. He hadn't left me out of the will because he hated me. He had left me out because he knew his kids would fight like wolves over a carcass, and he wanted to see which of us would rise above the hunger. The letter was more than a note, it was a verdict. He named me executor, the one with the authority to decide what happened next. Not David, not Linda. Me. The son they had written off as the loser. The irony was so sharp I could have cut glass with it. For a moment I just sat there, letting it sink in. The power wasn't in the piles of money or the properties or the Cadillac David had posed with online. The power was in the pen, the right to decide how this story ended. My father had passed me the ink to rewrite everything, and my siblings finally realized it. David's face was drained of its usual smugness, his jaw slack. Linda leaned forward, her pearls rattling as she whispered my name like it was suddenly holy. Then the begging started. David muttered about how we were family, how we could work something out. Linda clutched at her lawyer's sleeve, stammering that it wasn't fair, that she had counted on this inheritance. Tables had turned so fast they were dizzy. The predators were now the ones groveling, and for a brief, dark second I enjoyed the view. But satisfaction is a dangerous drug. You take too much and it owns you. My father's letter wasn't just a test of inheritance, it was a test of me. Sitting there, I could almost hear him barking in that gravel voice, "Don't be like them. Don't sink to their level." And as much as I wanted to watch David squirm and Linda's perfect facade crack into dust, I knew I couldn't let revenge steer my hand. When the judge asked for my decision as executor, I stood, steadying myself with a breath that felt heavier than a verdict. "Sometimes betrayal isn't about money," I said, voice carrying through the room. "It's about love you never said out loud. My father didn't say it, but he wrote it here. And I intend to honor it." The courtroom was still, every eye on me, waiting for a bloodbath. Instead I laid it out plain. The estate would be divided fairly among us, not because my siblings deserved it but because someone had to break the cycle. But one house, the old brick place in Chicago where it all began, I would keep. Not as a trophy but as a reminder of what loyalty costs and what silence hides. David's shoulders slumped, relief flickering in his eyes before shame drowned it out. Linda wiped at her mascara, muttering something about how she had misjudged me. Their gratitude didn't matter. What mattered was the line I was drawing, not in legal ink but in blood and memory. The property, the cars, the accounts, they were just numbers and objects. But that one house, the creaking floors and peeling wallpaper, that was history carved into walls, laughter and arguments soaked into plaster. That was the part of my father I wasn't letting go. When the gavel came down and the case was closed, I walked out into the New York evening air. The city hummed with life, indifferent to the drama that had just unfolded. My siblings trailed behind, quieter than I'd ever seen them, like children who'd just been scolded by the only voice they feared. I didn't look back. My father's last word wasn't the will, It wasn't the money and it wasn't even the letter. His last word was the responsibility he left in my hands, the choice to be better or worse. That night, back in my apartment, I took out the draft will and the final note and laid them side by side. The pen sat on the desk next to them, a cheap ballpoint with the weight of a sword. It struck me then. Inheritance isn't a stack of deeds or a bank account with too many zeros. The real inheritance is the moment you're forced to decide what kind of person you're going to be when the chips are down. My father handed me that decision, even if he couldn't say the words himself. And so the story ended not with me rich, not with them ruined, but with the truth finally written the way it was meant to be. The true inheritance wasn't what I gained. It was holding the pen when it mattered most and writing the ending myself. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.